Okay, I think that we will get started. I want to welcome all of you here for this first Brody Forum of the academic year 22-23. I'm Betty Duke. I'm the Florence and Norman Brody Forum professor here at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Florence Brody was an alum of the university, and Norman said he was an alum by marriage. They believed in the power of education to change the world. And they thought through ideas and leadership, they could make a difference. And so on that basis, they endowed a public policy forum to encourage the discussion of the major issues of our time. Their work is carried on today by their son, Bill, and his wife, Susan, and stepdaughter, Deirdre, and by their daughter, Sherry, and her partner, Bonnie. And so we are very fortunate that over the years, we have had Brody speakers come from a variety of thought areas, government officials, media folks, members of deliberative bodies, and many, many other thought leaders. My pleasure today is I get to introduce a thought leader that I have the joy of working with on a regular basis, the dean of our school, Bob Orr. Dean Orr has been with us as the dean for 8 years, during which he has led the expansion of our graduate school to include undergraduate, master's, PhD, and executive programs, and to lead us into a glorious new building. Prior to coming here, he was the Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Planning at the United Nations from 2004 to 2014. Prior to that, he was the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And before that, he was the director of the Council of Foreign Relations in Washington. He served in many major governmental posts as well. We are so lucky to have Bob Orr as our dean. Dean Orr.
Thank you so much, Betty. It is a joy to be with you all today and to welcome our special guest, Admiral Dennis Blair. I think trying to do an introduction of someone like Admiral Blair is particularly challenging, not because there's plenty to talk about. In fact, that's the problem. There's a little bit too much. I would just say that the match between our Brody Forum and Admiral Blair couldn't be better. The Brody Forum focuses on leadership and leaders, and I would say that Admiral Blair is a quintessential leader in multiple spaces. While he has a very distinguished military career, having served on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, having served as the Commander-in-Chief for the U.S. Pacific Command. He has also been central in the intelligence community, being the 3rd Director of National Intelligence, the Associate Director of the CIA for Military Affairs. But he is also what I would call a public intellectual on matters of strategy for the United States. In recent times, Admiral Blair has served on just about every major commission that has occurred in the United States on issues as far-ranging as national security strategy for 5G, oil security 2025, U.S. national security policy in an era of domestic oil abundance, and the report of the Commission on the Theft of American Intellectual Property. You can see a wide-ranging lens that Admiral Blair uses to address strategic opportunities and challenges. But one thing that I wanted to focus on, and I didn't warn Admiral Blair of this in advance, he won't remember this, but I certainly do. When I was selected as a White House fellow, you had this incredible opportunity to range across the U.S. federal government to find a boss for a year. And while I was ranging across the US federal government, I had the opportunity to be interviewed by Admiral Blair. He put me through my paces. We talked about Asia, we talked about security, we talked about just about everything. And of course, had I not gotten an offer in at the National Security Council in the White House and wanted to stay there, my heart was going wherever Admiral Blair was. So, Admiral, thank you for a probably the best interview I've ever had that did not result in a job. But I appreciate the mentorship that you gave me, even in the course of that interview. Admiral Blair, you are most welcome with us here today, and it's a joy to have you.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Orr. I'm sure that that you didn't come work for me was my loss, not yours. And you've certainly had a life of service yourself throughout your time, and you're continuing it, certainly running this fine school. So I'm going to talk for maybe 15 minutes or so about what I see as the big outlines of this international security environment that the United States and the rest of the world is entering here in 2022. But I'm most anxious to get to your questions, because that will, I think, focus the remarks much more. But let me give you some sort of framework ideas to start with. It seems to me that the United States is entering a new phase in our national security strategy, our engagement with the world, and it will combine features of the old Cold War years that we knew up until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union in about 1990, and we'll also combine features of this post-Cold War world that we've been dealing with for about the last 30 years, which has taken various twists and turns. And of course, it will have its own new features. And I think driving these new features will be the developments in technology, particularly the internet. I don't think we're through with the fourth technological revolution, the information technology revolution. We're all becoming much more connected with the internet and all of its social media and many forms of communication that it supports. The growth of non-government international organizations. Dean Orr, of course, served in the United Nations, which is the traditional large multinational organization, but there are many others now, international business organizations that do business and have influence across the globe. There are international nonprofits which have the resources of small countries behind them and have their own impact and their own agendas, and even private individuals who operate across international boundaries. And all of this will mix up with the traditional geopolitical approaches that we take both to major powers with nuclear weapons and to smaller countries, some of which also have nuclear weapons. So let's look at the sort of countries that we've been dealing with in the post-Cold War period that will carry forward into the future. There are still countries that have this combination of being dictatorships, repressing their own people. They are troublemakers within their regions, and they threaten American interests as well. That sort of trifecta, which for the past 30 years has caused us to take serious action with them. Iran and North Korea are the most prominent examples right now, but they now have nuclear weapons. North Korea openly proclaims them, and Iran, of course, is a near nuclear power and may well go that direction pretty soon. And there still are many countries that threaten regional stability and our interests, not by their strength, but by their weakness. And these are places like Myanmar, like Venezuela, and these countries have a way of attracting international interest and concern, and sometimes action and intervention, including that of the United States. There still are violent Islamist groups that consider the United States an enemy to be attacked. They live these days mostly across North Africa. Organizations there that have been affiliated with Al Qaeda, with Daesh. They're still in parts of the Middle East, and although right now they don't seem to have the ambitions and capability that Al Qaeda developed before it conducted the 9/11 attacks, or that the Daesh organization was able to stimulate with its jihadi propaganda that could break out at any time. Now, American military forces, of course, have been in action continuously since the Cold War ended. I was in the armed forces at the time it did, and we thought there was a chance we could be able to stack arms and stand down, but really our Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force have been in action almost continuously since that time. But by and large, what distinguished these operations was that they were really discretionary uses of military force. We chose to use military force to advance our interests. Those interests were generally limited. They did not involve existential threats to the country. Concerns of nuclear escalation were not prominent in them. Now, conventional wisdom is that there will be little appetite for interventions like Afghanistan and Iraq, or even the earlier interventions in Bosnia, Kosovo, places like that. However, I think we've learned over time that geopolitical and domestic developments have a way of grabbing you, whether you intended to get involved in them when you came into office as a new administration or not. So those are sort of the elements of the post-Cold War period, the last 30 years, that I think will carry forward and we'll still be dealing with. But at the same time, we have these major power rivalries. They've been prominently featured in the national security strategies that have been published by the outgoing Trump administration and the incoming Biden administration. They involve rivalries with big countries with big armed forces and nuclear weapons, Russia and China. In recent years, in recent months, really, the saber rattling has become louder. President Putin said that nuclear weapon use was a possibility in Ukraine, and then he said, "I'm not bluffing." My experience is, if you have to say I'm not bluffing, you probably are, but we can talk about that a little bit later. President Xi held a Congress of the Communist Party of China that anointed him for another 5-year term, breaking the precedent set by Deng Xiaoping previously. And if you listen to his speech at that party Congress, it was different from his predecessors. I guess I've watched 4 of these Chinese leaders, and they generally talked in terms of the international situation being a benign or favorable situation for Chinese development. Xi, on the other hand, talked about rough waters, the need to prepare for difficult tasks, to have military capability prepared, and this is different from his predecessors. So there's more possibility of confrontations with China developing than was true in the past. North Korea continues to lob missiles into the water all the time and to talk about its military capabilities. But of course, there have been very positive developments in the United States security interests that I think will put us in a stronger position as we go into this new era. One of the most important has been the actions of U.S. allies. Japan in particular, our strongest ally in Asia, is really entered a new era under Prime Minister Abe, who was tragically assassinated several months ago. But under his leadership, Japan has been moving forward to take more responsibility for its own defense, to equalize the security relationship with the United States, and that's been continued under Prime Minister Abe's successors. Japan now talks about breaking through the traditional 1% spending barrier, 1% of GDP spending barrier for its armed forces. It's talking about having to develop counterstrike capabilities. And basically, in my time working with Japan in our alliance, they have moved from being really a follower. The term that was used was the United States was the spear, Japan was the shield, but they've moved to a much more equal relationship, balanced relationship, and that's a good thing. There have been dramatic developments in Europe. Germany has undertaken to increase its defense budget, and it's finally woken up to the consequences of being dependent on Russia for all of its natural gas. Sweden and Finland have joined NATO. This is something we've been trying in the alliance to do for decades, and Putin managed to do it for us in 6 weeks. So that's a big improvement in deterrent capability in Europe. As for our enemies, Iran is under siege from its own citizens. These protests that have been going on in the streets have lasted far longer than those that have previously beset the theocratic regime there, and they are not resolved to this day. North Korea's saber rattling is for the moment confined to shooting missiles into the water and blustering, and we haven't seen a real military challenge there. And the resumption of exercises between the United States and the Republic of Korea, I think, has increased deterrence on the peninsula. So things internationally, although they're becoming more complicated, there are positive developments for the United States. And meanwhile, back here, the Biden administration is making sensible steps to strengthening our military capabilities. So overall, the security environment, although it's more complicated, although it will take, I think, more skill to maneuver, I think it is in many ways becoming more favorable for the United States. Let me turn quickly to the international events that are on everybody's mind right now, which are Russian invasion in Ukraine and the effect of that potentially on trouble with China over Taiwan in particular. First, a couple of observations on the Ukraine that you may have not heard. You can learn a great deal about it by the reporting. This is one of the most covered wars that I can think of. But a few things that have struck me. To me, it's confirmed that armed forces that give a great deal of initiative and that empower their lower ranks, give them the modern weapons and give them general guidance on what to do, can overcome centralized, top-down directed armed forces, no matter how much equipment those perhaps larger but muscle-bound and top directed armed forces are. And that's good news for the United States, because that's the way we train, that's the way we fight, we and our allies. It's not the way the Chinese fight. Another thing I've noticed is, I'd say a good rule going forward is don't invade a country and think that you can subdue it if it has a sanctuary right across the border. The enemy your opponent can wait you out and come back no matter what you do in that country. Think back to Vietnam with its sanctuary in China and in Laos and Cambodia. Think back to the Russians in Afghanistan. Think back to us in Afghanistan, and think about that 600 some odd mile border that Poland has that Ukraine has with Poland. That is really both a sanctuary and a portal for support to come into Ukraine. As a counterexample, the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq did not have a sanctuary across the border, and Saddam Hussein himself went into a hole into Crete in the middle of his country and was captured there. Third observation I'd make is that cyber war has not been as dominant as many had predicted and feared. I'd say prevailing opinion among the pundits back in February was that Russia would be able to shut down Ukraine infrastructure, but that simply hasn't been the case. President Zelensky is in touch with his country and with international countries, and in the Ukraine, where they haven't been destroyed by direct Russian attacks, the utilities are on, the lights are running, the transportation system works. So that's been done mainly by Ukrainian cyber defenders, but with a lot of help from other countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, Latvia, the Netherlands. So there can be cyber defense. And finally, we've proved again, I think, that nuclear weapons may be good for ensuring that your country does not lose a war, but they cannot be used to win a war against an opponent determined to fight hard on conventional terms. And that's mainly the reason why I don't think President Putin's rhetoric on nuclear weapons is more than just rhetoric. How do I think Ukraine will end? I think the Ukrainians will push the Russians out. They'll make more gains this year, and they'll finish the job next year. And then it's sort of up to the Russians as to how they take care of this guy who got them into such trouble. But I think the top leaders around Putin will realize that he led their country in disaster. They'd be better off without him than with him, and he will move on in some fashion. So let's see. I have some ideas about how this applies to the situation in Taiwan. Let me just say those in about 30 seconds. I think basically the lessons from Ukraine have increased deterrence in Taiwan, made it less likely that the Chinese would be tempted to make a military move there, and will continue to push that competition with the United States, and they're striving for influence in the region to the places that it ought to be, which are economic competition, diplomatic competition of ideas. Because if you look at the sort of lack of success the Russians have had invading a determined opponent across a land border, think how much more difficult it is to go across 80 miles of open water with an operation the size of Normandy, first time out of the chute for an armed forces that hasn't been involved in any sort of military activity since 1979 and didn't do very well back then. And in addition, I think the comprehensiveness and the size of the sanctions against against Russia for unprovoked aggression have been a surprise. And China does not have the advantage Russia has of supporting energy supplies, which have not been badly hit by Western sanctions for the obvious reason. China mainly exports manufactured goods for which there are generally more expensive but available substitutes. So I think as China looks at Ukraine, they must think that military aggression against Taiwan is something that is very high risk, and that they should continue to try to compete in other ways. So that's how I see the international situation. I see it by no means as, I see it complicated for the United States, but we have many advantages and things are going our way in many areas. And we just need to keep our heads to make wise decisions in terms of our diplomatic, economic, and military affairs. And we need to work together as a country and solve some of this internal dysfunction, which is keeping us from being the country that we should be and that we have been in the past. Dinor, let me turn it over to you at that point, sir.
Fantastic. Thank you, Admiral. That was an exemplary, from a scholarly point of view, tour de horizon. Like, we got to see all the major trends in the world that and try to make sense of them if I could start with a couple questions to you, departing from some of your points about Russia and China. If we pull back for a minute and look at the rise of autocracy writ large in the world, before delving into some of the major states, when I was a graduate student a million years ago, all the professors felt the need to assign Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, which
Right.
we graduate students poked lots of holes in at the time, and history actually poked holes in after that. But for today's graduate students on this call and undergraduate students, they are not experiencing not only the establishment of a community of democracies around the world, but a wave of autocratic developments in countries as disparate as Hungary, Turkey, Brazil, Philippines, and that's even before you get to the major system players like Russia and China. Can you say a word about what you think is driving the rise of autocracy across the world? And if there's anything that US policymakers can do to address this broader wave before delving into any specific country situations?
That's a very important question, you know, I've been working with Freedom House, organization that has been tracking these sort of things for many years. And again, if you step back and make your eyes squinty, the overall direction of sort of human development has been towards increasing democratic forms of government. There have been three big waves of it in history, and I don't think it's too much more complicated in that then people like to make decisions about their own lives, their government, and so on. And eventually that human idea will break through. There used to be these ideas that, oh no, it's cultural. White Anglo-Saxons can be Democrats, but other people cannot be. And then we've seen democratic developments across Latin America. We saw the Arab Spring in Asia, which hasn't been consummated in most countries, but nonetheless, I think it gave us a sense that the people in that region are not happy with either theocratic regimes or with military dictators. And then in Asia, of course, we've seen countries from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, even and Indonesia move in a democratic direction. So I think the underlying trend is in the right direction. Now we've had about 15 years in which these carefully measured indicators of freedom and democracy have been in fact in recession. And I think that's primarily not that the people around the world are liking dictators more. I think it's that the dictators are becoming more clever in being able to hold on to power. And it's of course no secret why anyone wants to be a dictator. And once you take power, your personal feelings are that you're the best thing that ever happened to your country, and you have all of the tools of repression and corruption which can do that. And sometimes you have ideological things like Communist Party doctrine or theocratic doctrine, which seem to support it. But so I think what we're seeing is sort of the empire striking back after a period in which many countries were moving to democracy. The existing dictators began to double down. The other phenomenon, which is distressing, which you referred to, is even within the established democracies, we're seeing challenges to some of the foundations of democracy, which are an open and secure voting system, which are the idea of a loyal opposition. If you lose an election, then you go out and try to win it the next time. That if you win an election, you don't manipulate the powers of government during your time in office to try to keep you there longer, and we're seeing deterioration in those ideas in our country, frankly, and in many other countries. So I think those of us who believe that democracy should be the way of the future need to fix our own democracies, and at the same time support those who are struggling for it in their countries. And as you know, that there's been you can support democracy in stupid ways, and you can support it in smart ways. And when you try to impose it by force in an unplanned way, the way we did in Iraq, you're asking for trouble. You have that same Francis Fukuyama and others have done a great deal of research on what it takes to have a solid democracy, and institutions are a very important part of it. Judiciary, elections, responsible security officials, individual rights, minority rights in the tradition. And so you can't just go in and, you can't just add water, shake, and you have a democracy. It's hard, grinding work, most of which has to be done by the people in the country concerned, and those of us outside can help if we're smart, but we can't run it. So I think sometimes we get a little crude in our democratic talk, but I think we have practitioners, people like you who've been in the business for a long time, who know how to help countries to move in the right direction on a longstanding basis. And it's just so basic, isn't it? What did I hear last week? Demonstrators in Mexico who are demonstrating against the current very popular president, and their chant was democracy. I mean, it's just what people want. And if we help, we who believe in it, help them in a smart way, and don't give tools to their enemies, I think that the trend can be good. And the Russia and China, last point, I guess, the Russia-China alliance is very much an alliance of convenience. My enemy's enemy is my enemy. There's deep and abiding suspicion and differences across the Russia-Chinese border, and I think that's very much a marriage of convenience. You could see in February, the two leaders signed this incredible document which said that their friendship was without limits. And then you saw a couple of months ago the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, and President Xi was doing the Michael Jackson and sort of backing off a little bit from Ukraine. So that's not, that's not recreation of the Warsaw Pact by any means.
So I think I should have put you on my doctoral dissertation committee. I looked at U.S. efforts to support democracy, and I love your quote. There are smart ways to support democracy and stupid ways. That would have been a much more concise summary of my doctoral dissertation. If I could turn to China and Taiwan for a moment, you've spent so much time in the Pacific, focused on the Pacific. Clearly, things are very much in flux, not just in U.S. relations with China, but in China itself. I think the meeting readout from President Biden and President Xi Jinping in the last 24 hours was intentionally upbeat from the Chinese side. They're clearly trying to pivot a little bit after their party Congress, and maybe trying to consolidate some things in China. And so maybe that will help get a little more engagement with the West and with the US. But Taiwan does seem like it is not just the old sticking point, it's the new sticking point as well for US-China. The strategic ambiguity about Taiwan and the entire Taiwan Relations Act really tried to strike a balance so that Taiwan wouldn't declare independence, and so China wouldn't feel the need to reunify Taiwan by force. President Biden has been tiptoeing around this while saying that our policy remains the same. He's been expressing increased support for Taiwan, and clearly that has gotten under President Xi's skin. How do you see the U.S. playing the Taiwan situation so as to enable a rapprochement with China while not giving up this fundamental commitment to Taiwan?
Yeah, I think the Taiwan Relations Act remains a very valid, and I admire the people who wrote that back when they did it for a couple of reasons. When people either in China or Taiwan ask me, will the United States intervene if there's a war? I'd say the answer is it depends how it starts. If Taiwan were to cross over one of these red lines that have been clearly set forth by China, if it declares itself independent, if it asks for American troops to be stationed on it again, if it decides to develop nuclear weapons, I think China would attack Taiwan because no Chinese leader could allow that to occur and expect to stay in power with all of the rhetoric that they have made, and probably what they actually believe. But I think Taiwan has learned what those red lines are. Under back in Li Tenghui days and Chen Zhou and so on, they pushed into that how independent can we get guardrail about as hard as they could, and I think they learned what the limits were. On the other hand, in the succeeding administration of the KMT party, they sort of push the other way. How far can we cozy up to China and establish all of these relations and allow creeping Chinese influence on Taiwan? And Taiwanese people say, nah, there are limits there too. So I think the politics of Taiwan have now sort of pushed governments, whether they come from the DPP or the AMT, into the center. So that's not likely. But if Taiwan took a lurch in that direction and tromped over a Chinese borderline, I don't see any reason the United States should go bail them out. They sort of brought that one on themselves. And I think most people in the region would feel that way. On the other hand, if China wakes up one morning and said, I've waited long enough, we're just going to go do it. We're going to send the troops in tonight. I think the United States would support Taiwan, and I'm quite convinced that we could support Taiwan to the point that the Chinese invasion would be defeated, because it's a tough operation. There are only so many places you can land in Taiwan, whether you come by helicopter or you come by amphibious vehicle. The Taiwanese know those much better than Chinese do. They've fortified all of them. Their great losses would take place. You eventually have to support an invasion with heavy shipping coming across, and that's very vulnerable to Taiwanese weapons, much less to American weapons at that time. So I think it remains, despite everything that China has done in terms of military modernization, a really high risk operation for them, and they're rolling the dice on something really big. And if they lose, which the probability is that they would, then that's sort of not only the end of Xi Jinping, but the end of the Communist Party in China, I think, because they've staked they put such heavy emphasis on that. So I think China looks at that calculation and says, I'm going to keep up the rhetoric. I'm going to keep building up. Maybe I need the capability in case Taiwan takes a lurch in the wrong direction. I've got to be able to punish them and go on. But I think that the way to compete is to continue this amazing economic growth that they've had, to do this sort of whole of government push that they make to increase their influence around the region and ultimately around the world. And although it's frustrating that they can't solve the Taiwan problem, I think they have over time taken a more conservative decision to do that. And so I think the United States needs to keep up that keep our same policy. For one thing, the strategic ambiguity, I think, keeps Taiwan under control, which frankly, we all have friends in Taiwan. They're a country to admire in terms of their development and democracy, but they, should not be allowed to drag the United States into a conflict that is in their interest and not in ours. And so I think we should keep it ambiguous. I think they need to build up their armed forces. We need to build up the capability, should we have to keep time on. And I'd say things are favorable. When I was a commander out there in 99, 2000, we could keep China from taking Taiwan without scratching the paint. I mean, they were just not very capable. Now they are capable, and they did that by spending those years building up their armed forces, just exactly with weapons that would be designed to raise the cost of the United States of supporting them. I mean, we would have damaged ships, we would have shot down aircraft, we would have dead sailors and dead airmen, but we would succeed. But now the United States is looking back at that same weapons balance, and we are now building the weapon systems which will counter and offset what China has been doing for 30 years. And so we will, in fact, increase deterrence. It's kind of like a crew race. You pull on the oar and your shell goes ahead, and then you think, doing pretty well. I'm in the lead, and then oops, the other guy took a pull on the other people took pulls on their oars, and now they're catching up or they're going ahead. So I think we're in that military phase in which the things we're doing, like hypersonic weapons, unmanned vehicles, the strength of Japan and so on, which is making China less likely to think they would succeed in a cross-channel invasion. So I think if we keep our heads about it, and don't get carried away and change things that don't really need changing, we're in good shape.
Well, I have to thank you, Admiral, for that analysis, because level-headed analysis of China and Taiwan these days is hard to find. I would qualify that as in the level-headed analysis category. Thank you. I would like to now turn it over to Micah Pickus, our graduate student and Brody scholar, to manage the student questions and the discussion with Admiral Blair. So I'm going to blip out here, turn it over to Micah with only one condition. Micah, you and the Admiral are not allowed to conduct this entire conversation in Russian. You have to do it in English for the rest of us, okay?
All right. Well, I'll stick to.
Good to see you, Dinor. Yeah.
And you.
English. All right, Admiral Blair, thank you again so much for joining us. Just listening to the discussion between you and Nadine, can clearly see that you guys have had a lot to talk about. And in fact, you've already covered quite a bit of some of the pre-prepared questions that we had. So I'll pivot just slightly, and I'll start with, you briefly mentioned the topic of sanctuaries relative to Russia, Ukraine. You mentioned Saddam, and so the first question that came from an additional question is that considering Poland, which you mentioned as a sanctuary vis-a-vis Ukraine, just emerged from poverty into its current strong standing about 35 years ago, is it in your view that the U.S. is sort of supporting this development of sanctuary countries as a policy?
I don't think so. I think that's just sort of the way it turned out because of the geography of Ukraine and Poland. That's where the Russians chose to invade, and so that's where NATO is pushing the weapons through. But of course, there are sanctuaries. There are sanctuaries and there are sanctuaries. Pakistan was almost a reluctant sanctuary for the Taliban and Al Qaeda. I mean, they would just have soon not been a sanctuary there, but geography condemned them to be one. And then they played this very mixed role of cooperating with the United States on some actions against the Al Qaeda and Taliban, primarily with drones, objecting vehemently to any American raids or troops going across the border, which we basically refrained from doing until 2011 when we went after Osama bin Laden himself. I think Poland is and Laos and Cambodia in the Vietnam War were sort of reluctant but powerless sanctuaries because they didn't have the armed forces to patrol their own borders or enforce their laws, and so North Vietnam would go into that country with the Ho Chi Minh Trail and others, and then the United States and South Vietnam would go in and fight them there. Sanctuaries vary, but I think Poland is frankly a pretty willing sanctuary because of their long time, fear and damage at the hands of Russia and the Soviet Union over the years. So I think they were perfectly happy to support Ukraine and felt it was in their interests. And so for Russia, they're the worst kind of a sanctuary country, one that has skin in the game and is interested in the outcome and has a lot of big other countries supporting it: the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, all of the other members, almost all of the other members of NATO. So I'd say that makes it particularly difficult for Russia, and it's part of Putin's complete miscalculation in invading the way he did. He clearly has turned into one of those dictators who surrounds himself with sycophants, who does not listen to conflicting advice that might make him smarter or even dissuade him from doing a stupid thing in the first place. And he's surrounded himself with an echo chamber, didn't think through either the military or the geographical basis of what he was doing, and now he's paying the price.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned miscalculation, and so just sort of pivoting briefly from one of the questions that we had thought about asking was about an exit ramp for Putin, and pivoting slightly from that, since you mentioned miscalculation, and also as a military person yourself with a military background, and certainly tactical and strategic, you also mentioned the vertical power structure, the top-down approach that you've sort of seen in Russia, both in the government and also, I imagine, in the military as well. And so, speaking to the miscalculation, what sort of factors stand out to you there's a million reasons why we could say this is failing on so many counts, but specifically from your military background, looking at this, what are some of the primary reasons that you feel Russia has failed to so sort of spectacularly fall so far short of what Putin at least set out to achieve?
If you look at that initial invasion plan, the Russian original plan was to make that thrust down from Belarus, get into Kyiv, drive out the Zelensky government and install some sort of a puppet government, and expected the rest of the country to surrender and say, well, it looks like we're back to the days when we had a pro-Russian government. We've been there before. This is not going to be terrible. And I think that was the initial thing they had in mind. There were thrusts from the areas they were occupying to the east and the south, but I think they were trying for this decapitation, take over the capital kind of a strategy. And so that miscalculation was huge. I think even if they had entered Kyiv, I don't think the Ukrainians would have surrendered. I think Zelensky would have retreated to another more Western country, stayed in stayed in the government, not surrendered, and the war would have gone on. And the Russians, of all people, should know about giving up territory for
Right.
not surrendering. I mean, it was their classic tactic. And although Ukraine's not as big as Russia, it's bigger than Texas, and there's a lot of space there. So I think that was a big miscalculation. Clearly, he way overestimated the capability of his armed forces, and he was bewitched by the amount of money he'd given the armed forces, the advanced weapons they have, and he completely undervalued the importance of the people who operate the equipment, and the motivation and the skill of the lower levels. I've talked to American Army officers who were involved in the training of the retraining of Ukrainian soldiers and other servicemen, and they said that the transformation, when you just took away the traditional Warsaw Pact top-down style of fighting and showed the Ukrainians what could be done with bottom-up initiative in lower areas, taking advantage of the full range of weapons capability. The Ukrainian soldiers, from the sergeants up through the junior officers, just felt that they were liberated, and basically they had transformed their armed forces up to about the 2-star general level. And in February, they got rid of the last of the Warsaw Pact 3- and 4-star generals, promoted some of their best junior general officers, and so they have an incredibly effective armed forces. And so that was another miscalculation that I think Putin made of the fighting ability of a numerically smaller armed forces. He miscalculated the number of troops that he would need to hold territory, even if he were to capture it. And then finally, I think he badly overestimated the leverage that he would have on Germany and other countries with supplying their natural gas. He thought that Germany would acquiesce to Russian interests in Ukraine because of the dependence on Russian natural gas, and he underestimated both the resilience of the Germans and the extraordinary adaptation that they've been able to do with finding other sources of liquefied natural gas and others. So, five big, terrible strategic mistakes, and I'm sure there are more.
Great. And I guess we'll just finish up with one or two more questions. One coming from Nancy Gallagher, Dr. Nancy Gallagher, who I'm sure you've bumped into. And she asks, you mentioned earlier that Ukraine, you said that the war in Ukraine shows that having nuclear weapons doesn't ensure that Russia will win the war, but might ensure it doesn't lose. And that you then expressed optimism that Ukraine would prevail conventionally within the following year and then drive Russia out. So her question is, if that's true, has having nuclear weapons given Russia any real advantage vis-a-vis Ukraine?
Yeah, I don't think it's given any Russian any real advantage, because when I'm saying nuclear weapons can ensure that you don't lose a war, I'm talking about losing a complete war, having your capital invaded, your government driven into exile. I mean, if any country is defeating a nuclear opponent by conventional means, you're always have to give pause before you make a final drive on the capital, before you drive them out, because at that point, the incentive structure might be that the ruler at that point would say, well, hell, I'm going down anyway. I'm going to be strung up, shot, killed. I'm going to give orders to fire these nuclear weapons as a last desperate measure to stop this final drive in which I will lose leadership of my country. Now, the people that you give those orders to may or may not follow them at that point. We all remember the series of blood-curdling orders that Hitler gave in his final days when it was clear he was going to be defeated, destroy Paris, fire off all of the V2s, and the German high command said, wait a minute, you may be committing suicide in the bunker, but there are a lot of Germans who are going to be around, and we're not going to make it any worse for ourselves in a war that we're clearly going to lose. So there'd be that question. So I think it's this, I've watched the United States and the Soviet Union try to find positive gains that they could get at lower levels with nuclear weapons. And, God, we had thousands of these battlefield weapons and medium range weapons. And we never really figured out a way to point those at a country and say, okay, turn over this piece of territory or stop this practice that you're doing. I saw China, I saw Pakistan and India go through the same thing as they developed nuclear weapons. They had they weren't involved in an existential struggle of who survives India or Pakistan. They were fighting over Jammu, Kashmir, and some other pieces of property. And neither one of them could figure out a way to point a nuclear weapon at the other country and say, give me back that disputed territory or else I'll put a nuclear weapon on you. So Russia, those weapons just aren't useful in that kind of from Russia's point of view, limited objective of taking over Ukraine. So that's what I mean. That's what I mean by it. And I think that it's dangerous. There's a small chance that Russia might use the weapons, but it's not as dangerous as Putin would like to make it.
Sure. Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. So,
okay,
pivoting a little bit away from U.S., Russia, Ukraine, and looking at, once again at the U.S.-China relationship. There's a question here about what do you think the U.S. should be doing to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative? And I guess I'll add to that and just say, is there something worth noting about how, the Belt and Road Initiative is very much an economic push from China. U.S. has sort of tried the spread of democracy, spread of ideals. Russia has, basically invaded and annexed other neighboring countries when it wants to sort of assert itself over neighbors, and that there's sort of different strategies for doing this. Given that we've sort of opted for different techniques here, if you will, what should the U.S. be doing to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative, or can we?
I think we can, if the we is not just the United States, but the United States and China and like-minded European countries. The infrastructure needs, the attractiveness of the Belt and Road Initiative is that the infrastructure needs across Southern Asia and the Middle East are huge. There's a very underdeveloped transportation sector there of all modes of transportation, and so at that high level, if outside countries can help develop those transportation links, that's a good thing, and that's what China was playing into. However, where China went wrong was number one, insisting that it not lose any money in this proposition. Number two, in really having this no strings attached approach to it, so that they would play into the hands of the local, in many cases, repressive government. And that's just we've learned that's a formula for corruption, misuse of funds, projects going to the wrong purposes and all. And we've seen all of that with China in Sri Lanka and in other countries in Africa and Pakistan. And so, I think it should encourage the United States and Japan and European countries that support things like the World Bank to to take another look at approaches to increasing the infrastructure in South Asian and Middle Eastern countries, but it has to be based on some sort of things that make economic sense. It has to leave capability behind in the country. You can't just bring in outside contractors and do the construction and then leave. You have to work with the local governments and leave capacity there. You have to try to use your influence while you're doing it to improve governance in those countries and not take part in the corrupt and misguided things. So I think it would be a good thing if it stimulated competition from the United States and other countries to do it the right way. And I see some of that. I see some of that developing both individually. I'm most familiar with Japan, and Japanese are putting more money into things like the Asia Development Bank and their bilateral aid, and that's all good. But so that's I think the approach is, and the African and South Asian and Middle Eastern countries are pretty sophisticated, I think, and given half a chance, they will choose the right sort of development, not the kind that will bust their treasuries, bust their current accounts, put ports in the wrong places, leave no capability behind, and fail to build institutions. So I'm optimistic that if we work together with our allies, we can more than match what the Chinese have on offer in any places except the most corrupt dictatorships, which are going to take whichever project will help them and their buddies.
Great. All right. Well, I think on that note, I'll just thank you one more time for sharing all your thoughts and insights. And Dinor, I kept my promise. We did it in English.
You did it all in English. You didn't make any of us have to try to do a translation. I appreciate that. And I just want to thank Micah, our Brody scholar, and Professor Betty Duke, our Brody professor, but especially our Brody Forum guest today, Admiral Blair. You gave us a masterclass on geostrategy. I appreciate that. I also appreciate seeing you again, and thank you for being one of our country's leading public intellectuals. We need it all. Thank you.
Okay, best of luck. Bye. Mika paka.
Paka paka.
Take care. Thank you, everybody.